All right. Our next presentation is going to be absolutely fascinating. Adrian is one of my favourite clean energy lawyers. Also has a really interesting role and has lots of experience both in Africa, in Australia, all over the world really now. And when we're talking about what kind of things we might talk about, we had a range of topics. We settled on cyber security because I think it's going to be really critical. And I happen to coincide on that with me having to call the security services about a planned change to our law that made me just realise that actually there was quite a massive national security overlay that they needed to be alerted to. So I think you'll find this very interesting. I'll be interested to see if the issue that I identified has been reported. So, yeah.
Fantastic. I hope you find it interesting. I really do. So hi, everyone. My name's Adrian. I work at a firm called Hamilton Locke. I'm a senior associate there in the new energy team. Now, what makes Hamilton Locke a cool place, especially our team, is we only do new energy. So it's only things that are clean and green and good. Two of my colleagues are here, Ali and Asida, and this presentation was put together by Ali. So thank you, Ali. Great job. So a little bit about me. So as Penny said, I come from South Africa originally, practiced there for quite a number of years, helped with the beginning of the renewable energy program in South Africa. So at one point we were developing 98 renewable energy projects. So I advised the off-taker there, and that was solar, wind, hydro, biomass, and then eventually we did a little bit of nuclear as well. And South Africa got stuck on the coal train. So a little bit of that, unfortunately, too. Then I moved to Australia, worked in the energy construction for 3.5 years, and now at Hamilton Locke, where I'm doing energy work. So my focus, and so our team's focus, is energy across the entire value chain. My focus is on the construction bits in the energy value chain. So the discussion we're having today is cybersecurity development, which is, of course, very, very broad. We are kind of limiting that to just say how it impacts on renewable energy projects, and specifically how it impacts on the renewable energy projects that have already been constructed. Okay, so tell me, who here are students? What's the split of people here? I just want to know how I'm talking about what. Okay, perfect. So then maybe before I jump in, the way that we try to, when we present, you had the opportunity to listen to Matt today, the way that we try to do it when we present is we leave the academia to the academics. We're not going to interfere there, but we try to give you practical examples of the things that we are seeing, and then leave it to you smart people to figure out how to solve that. So when you develop an energy project, obviously starts at the development phase, someone has a brilliant idea. Then there's the developer goes and gets funding for the project. You probably go speak to Arena to see, get a nice grant in there. It's innovative. Hopefully you get a grant. All the information links. It's usually a little bit difficult with that. Then you go and you move to the construction phase of the project. So you usually talk there, the big contract we work with is EPC contracts. Procuring and construct contracts, so that's build the power station. And then after the power station is built, we go to the operation and maintenance phase. The thing that regulates that is the O&M contract. And it is specifically in the O&M phase where cybersecurity becomes quite important in these projects. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to set a little bit of a scene. We're going to talk about the relevant legislation and then about market developments. Okay, so obviously everybody here is aware cybersecurity is a big thing. There's a lot of cyber attacks happening. We all know about Medibank. I guess a lot of you have to check whether your personal information was stolen by Optus. Hacked Optus. If you, the last report talking about the economic impact said that about 67,000 incidents of cybercrime in 2020 to 2021, and the self-reported loss of that was 33 billion. So it's quite big. Now, that relates to the personal information sphere. That is not what we're talking about. We're talking about cybersecurity as it relates to critical infrastructure for power stations. And that's treated a little bit differently in Australia. and it's managed under the the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, the SOCI Act. And it's basically to ensure that those assets that are critical to the country, they are managed as required. Okay, so yeah, of course, always. And it's actually interesting, and you'll see why further in there in a second. So, SOCI Act, that has the reports and compliance bits, and it doesn't really, there's penalties for not reporting, not notifying, or not preparing a plan, but that's as far as it goes. It doesn't impose a lot of other things. Then the third act, which extends the reach of the SOCI Act, and we'll talk about that in a second, and that is where a number of our clients are currently having issues. And then the last bit there is the AEMO application guide for registration as a generator, which AEMO is allowed to publish under the national energy rules, which falls under the national energy law. Okay, so application of the SOCI Act. So there's different critical infrastructure sectors, and there's 22 specific critical infrastructure types of assets that get regulated under this act. The ones that are important to us are critical electricity assets. So that would be an asset greater than 30 megawatt that's connected to the grid. Or what's also important is critical data storage and processing assets, and that would potentially be a data center that operates the facility. Now, in our instance, a lot of the clients that we're talking specifically about here are operation and maintenance contractors. All of these people run control centers. So companies building a power station, around the country, and these guys go out and say, fine, we will manage your power station for you. A big part of that is obviously it's algorithm running the bidding in the market, but a large part of it is having a control and knowing how to look after this asset. Now, up to recently, most of these control centers sat overseas because they were way cheaper overseas. But now, because of the SOCI Act and its interplay with the third act, which we'll discuss in a second to see where the issue this comes in. Now, the SOCI Act distinguishes between responsible entities and direct interest holders. A responsible entity would be an entity that holds a license or an approval to run a facility. It's actually quite interesting how it works. We spoke to the cybersecurity center about this, because if you hold a license, it would mean that you were licensed by someone to run a facility, but the definition is drafted quite broad. It also says you can hold an approval, in brackets, of whatever nature to run a facility. So then the question becomes, well, if I have an approval from my employer to run this facility, am I caught under responsible entity or not? They didn't give us a direct answer when we asked about this. Or said we can give you a general indication of how this should be interpreted, but this is not legal advice. So yeah, responsible entities is an interesting question, what they actually are. And responsible entities will then have specific reporting requirements under the Act. And then, of course, we have direct interest holders. So that would be an entity that can control a power station or has more than a 10% interest in the power station. So the obligations imposed by the SOCI Act there's many, but the three big ones is to provide information concerning the asset. The information being provided for a responsible entity and for a direct interest holder is different. Different things that they need to tell the cybersecurity critical infrastructure register, I think it's called. They need to implement a cybersecurity framework, which is quite interesting. A couple of weeks ago, the rules were finalized on what those should now look like. So there's specific frameworks that these entities can comply with. And then, of course, you need to report cybersecurity incidences as well. And then there's penalties. The Act, these things are adhered to. I've talked a little bit about the stakeholders already. Now, where this becomes very interesting. So we've now spoken about the SOCI Act. SOCI Act talks about compliance and reporting and notification. Still, this doesn't really create a difficulty for most players. The issue comes in under the FIRB Act. So who knows what the FIRB Act is? Foreign acquisitions. Yeah. So when a foreign entity wants to invest in Australia, there's a whole process they need to go through to get approval to do that. The idea being that we don't want foreign entities to get able to control assets in Australia, so there's a whole process to go through to get approval. Now, under that, the Foreign Investment Regulatory regulatory board can make certain recommendations on conditions that must be placed on the approval allowing you to invest in the country. What we are seeing more and more is that one of the conditions that FIRB is imposing is that, actually, FIRB get that up. The condition is that all telecommunication infrastructure and control infrastructure must be based in Australia. Now, this is quite interesting because the SOGI Act that regulates cybersecurity in Australia doesn't deal with this at all. The FIRB Act that regulates investment imposes this condition. Why can it do it? Because the FIRB Act, you'll see up there, a national security business includes a business that is a responsible entity or a direct interest holder for a critical electricity asset or a data storage processing asset. So the two acts actually works together quite nicely to restrict how you can run your power station. Now, the reason why this is very important is when you develop a power station, and when you go through the process, obviously it's the funding at the beginning, you build the power station, and then there's certain milestones for payments coming from them. Depending on how your contracts with your lenders or your financiers, you will have certain tranches when you get paid as a developer, and then at some stage the developer wants to step back and go develop a new project. Because of this, most developers aren't worried about the operation and maintenance phase at all. They want the facility built, they want to build as quickly as possible, and they don't really care if it's operated well. So what we try to do in contracts, we draft performance guarantees in there and trying to make sure that it operates well, but generally developers aren't too worried about that. So they don't want to pay a lot for the operation and maintenance services things. The issue here is now if all of a sudden your chief control centers that sat somewhere overseas need to be moved onshore to Australia, your whole profit model doesn't work anymore because it's becoming too expensive to run a facility. To complicate this even more, FIRB only applies to people who want to invest in Australia. It doesn't apply to money that's already in Australia. So now if you're a business, you've had chief control centers overseas. Some of your clients can make use of that, but other clients need to make use of the control centers in Australia. So it means that you need to either decide to cater for certain markets, or you need to cater for both these markets and your overheads just go up, which means the operation maintenance costs go up, which means that your project becomes viable, means that your project cost needs to go up, so electricity prices go up. This all fits into a direction of thinking that we see across the energy industry. Now, AEMO has the ability, under the national energy rules, to develop materials to help generators register their facilities. Now, under the national energy rules, a generator isn't traditionally think a power station. Generator can also be an operator or a controller of the facility. So in other words, the power station itself needs to register, but in this case, our clients who operate the facilities need to register as well. Now, the AEMO registration guide obviously only has the powers that is given by the Act, but this registration guide now requires that applicants must provide contact details for their head office, control room, and trading room staff and relevant personnel, and that only Australian phone numbers are acceptable, and that all personnel must be based in Australia. So again, pulling it back more and more to Australia. Now, if we look at how the SOGI Act has developed over the years, and how all of these surrounding pieces of legislation and regulation have developed, it paints a very clear picture that Australia is serious when it comes to cybersecurity, and especially very serious when it comes to infrastructure in the energy space. So what do we want to leave you with? So best practice and guidance materials are generally a precursor to implementation of future requirements. It's a steady increase in guidance and legislation, and we are seeing so many clients come to us with the approvals requiring information communication technology for infrastructure to be located here. And then just last message there from the Minister of Home Affairs. So something that the press statement that was released a couple of weeks ago, I think. The increasing interconnected nature of critical infrastructure exposes vulnerabilities that can result in significant consequences to our security, economy, and sovereignty. It's very important. It's at the beginning stages now. It's not something, so as an energy lawyer and the person doing the construction bits, it's not something that I have had to deal with really ever. It's never been an issue. So very new, a very important thing to get across if you're going to operate in this industry in the next couple of years. Okay.
It's actually had to deal directly with this particular issue.
Oh, yeah.
To build a plant and register it with an overseas control. I don't know if this is actually that pertinent to most of the new projects that are actually starting up in the US. Do you know if the thresholds have changed for what is critical infrastructure?
So it is larger than 30 megawatts. And so,
Yeah. Okay, so it's not the guidance that they used to have, which is it needs to be a synchronous generating matters.
that
Actually,
actually,
have actually lowered it down.
yeah, that actually changed. And it was a huge thing about with the CEC had it. There was a bunch of big discussions going on. So yeah, it's you're absolutely right. It's all about the ratio. That's sure. Thank you. Yeah. About anything in energy in general. Okay.
Where this has also been an issue, I think it's fair to say, is around some of the remote, the attempts to change the remote settings on inverters, where we know that inverters are on the incorrect settings, and the government's going to go in and remotely fix them and get the manufacturers to do it, but where they're located, lots of kind of issues arising. So just also have that in the back of mind that these types of issues are popping up more and more.
By making companies based in Australia, just what are your examples of what does that actually give us other than just, like choosing in our regulatory system? What does that give us the basic?
That's absolutely valid. That's the thing of a lot of these countries. What's the practical?
What's the general response?
Appropriate response and why?
I was 300 women.
So why is that more secure? Another dimension. Yeah, but does it just make us feel safe, or is it actually safe?
Well, the 1-300 phone number that you mentioned, we had a client the other day that registered with AIMA, and what they did is they didn't have a direct line to the, because there's different areas that AIMA needs people, so they need other people, CEO, the one. And what they did to get beyond this is they set up a platform, 1-300 number, you come to the platform, it's like, hello, if you want to speak to the controller, please press on, people want to speak, and then it just patches through. But what's interesting is the rules actually don't allow for it. It requires a direct number, not allowed to go through a platform.
You can also get around with like buying a forward number. So it's
Yes.
like whatever, and that will be incentive run forward.
Which is what we then advise them to do as they very quickly actually. It's actually it's quite a big fun. Yeah, you grab it and get it out.
And how like the regulation of the notification for instructors split between the third. So like, do you think that's a satisfactory arrangement, or do you think there's some sort of streamlining that could happen?
While you're asking an energy or a cybersecurity. I think the reason is the app was drawn this way, that there's a very specific reason for it. I think it's to make it easy to pose conditions to the government. So they want to impose conditions on. There's no requirement to change the rules for the rates under the Safety Act. Decide you want to impose what on. Under third, the Treasury can impose whatever, basically, as soon as it falls in the cabinet. So it's a very fine that one to impose conditions. Should it be different? Thank you.
Any last question? No, please join me in thanking Andrew.
If you want to be a paralegal in marketing, okay, there's a lot of jobs in.
I told you guys. There we go. There we go. Thank you. Now our last speaker today has come to us. Oh my God. Yeah. Is it the one? What?
So, what is the first?
So, may I introduce Michele? Some of you have already met Michele. Michele is a PhD from Milan and has come over to do some comparative research looking at how Australia compares to Italy. And I can tell you what, this is fascinating stuff because Italy has been doing some really interesting stuff around land use planning, which is what Michele is going to be talking to us about today. And I think you'll see striking difference is what I would say. So I'm going to hand over.
Thank you so much, Ken. Thank you for the audience. I'm very happy to be here. It's been a pleasure to participate. So my presentation is slightly different from what we have heard so far. First of all, because I won't focus precisely on markets, I will focus more on land use, measuring UBS rate. And because obviously I'm looking mainly at legislation, and I hope and I agree with this topic, basically because we thought it would be quite interesting for Australian audience to have some insights from a different jurisdiction or perspective. Yeah. So, yeah, these are some information about me. So, as Merkel already said, I'm a Christian candidate at the Tuttavia, which is a quite small Italian university. I will be visiting the University of Sydney for 6 months or less. I've been admitted last year to the Italian bar after working for a couple of years in a law firm dealing with the energy sector, basically. And I'm also a member of some other association and law reviews in Chile. Right. So to give you some more context, I've tried to identify two guiding forces which brought the Italian legislator to legislate in this field, so in the field of location equivalent plans, and particular referring to land use. First one is the enforcement of the European directive. As you all well know, in Europe, we have directives which must be enforced by member states. And the directive 2018-2001 will require that Italy goes from an average of 1 gigawatt per year installed in the period right before 2021 to 8 gigawatts, which in the period 2021-2030. So as you can see from these tables, it's quite a big leap. Second guiding force is the one on war in Ukraine. So the 43% of the imported gas in Italy in 2020 came derived from Russia. So you can see Italy there. Italy actually is the second Western European countries speaking about reliance on Russian gas. If you don't consider Eastern Europe, if you don't consider Germany, Italy is the country which relies the most historically on Russian gas. This is a quick outlook of the energy mix, the electricity generation mix the first 6 months of 2021. So we can consider the blue part is gas, which is quite massive in percentage. And then you have all other technologies which are relatively less important in the energy mix. So this scenario, these two guiding forces or guiding principles, in a sense, brought the Italian legislature to the draft passing, and I would say also sometimes confusing policy legislation. So we have had 5 main interventions in only the last 2 years. Most of them had basically 2 objectives. The first is an environmental objective, complied with Directive 2018-2001. And the second is to ensure energy security and all that, all what derives from an energy security. So lower prices for consumers and so on. So I won't enter in detail of all this legislation. It will not be very useful. But what I will try to do is to identify the 3 main trends that characterize these pieces of legislation. So the first trend is a streamlined consent phase for solar panel or PVs or photovoltaic technologies. I'll give you some more context at this point. We have mainly 3 ways to authorize photovoltaic. The first one for very big projects is a single authorization, which requires an express authorization that is issued by the region. And with region, I'm referring to something that in Australia would be similar to state level. We have regions that are comparable to state level, and the state, which is what we call federal level. Then it's called PAS, the Simplified Authorization Procedure. This is based on the mechanism of silence consent and is submitted to the municipality. What is silence consent? This is an administrative law under which the developer submits all the project documentation to the municipality. If the municipality does not reply or convoke a steering committee within 30 days, the project is approved. And then we have the simple communication to the municipality for minor project. So, what was the quickest way for the legislature to develop and to put solar installation? Well, obviously, increasing the field of application of the PAS. The PAS was extended after being the threshold for PAS 1 megawatt for, I would say, 10, 15 years. In 2 years, the threshold was increased, and today the threshold is 10 megawatts, or in some areas, 20 megawatts. This means that more and more projects will be authorized through silence consent through this extremely simplified authorization procedure. This brings up, obviously, other projects. We can answer further in detail later, but I would just mention one. 2 municipalities, and in particular small municipalities, have the tool to deal with projects which are often massive. So we are speaking sometimes of projects which are about 19 megawatts. It's not really small project. So we have municipalities which are very small, but have very big areas under their control, and they are currently receiving many submissions by private developers that go under the PAS. If you want, I can give you more details later about these kind of problems, which also involve social license in a sense. So the second recent trend has been a shift of competencies in environmental impact assessment in the solar panel sector, utility sector. the legislator basically has shifted the competencies from a regional level to a federal state level. Not only, the legislator has also created a special commission called PNRR Commission under the State Ministry of Ecology. Whose aim is to streamline environmental impact assessment. So basically, the state legislator thought that environmental impact assessment carried out at a regional level was too low, brought too many hurdles for different reasons, and therefore created a special commission at a central level, at a ministerial level, which deals with the environmental impact assessment. Secondly, we've seen an extension of the use of the environmental impact assessment screening, which means that many projects now will not be assessed directly under environmental impact assessment, but there will be a first stage screening to understand if the project needs actually an environmental impact assessment. So you can see from this image, only minor projects whose power is comprised between 1 and 10 megawatts currently may undergo regional environmental impact assessment. All the other projects above 10 megawatts may or must undergo state environmental impact assessment. Until a couple of years ago, this was not the case. So most of the projects went under the environmental impact assessment made. I also mentioned a third point in this slide. The legislator has also tried to scale down the powers of the Ministry of Culture. The Ministry of Culture has historically had very strong power in environmental impact assessment proceedings, especially in areas which are under landscape constraints. So what the legislator has tried to do is to scale down the powers, which in most cases now, but I will not say most cases, in more cases than before, do not entail compulsory opinion by the Ministry of Culture, or even a binding opinion by the Ministry of Culture, but simply non-opinion of the Ministry of Culture. So basically the Ministry of Culture has been taken out by many projects and by many environmental impact assessment proceedings. But the third trend, which is quite interesting for Australia, I thought, are suitable areas. So suitable areas somehow we call the renewable energy zones, which you probably all know, but we will talk about it better later. Suitable areas are identified through a mechanism which comprises the cooperation between the central state, the central federal state, and regions. Basically, the Ministry of Ecological Transition is supposed in these months to identify the criteria which would be then used by regions to precisely identify the so-called suitable area. But why are these suitable areas so important? Well, because as we mentioned before, in some areas, in particular in suitable areas, the PV installation will find a stronger application of the EAS, and so of the silent content. Secondly, in these areas, landscape opinion, which, if you recall it, is issued by the Ministry of Culture, is compulsory but is not binding. So now I would like to shift from a strictly policy-making perspective to the case law. I'm talking in particular about the case law of the Constitutional Court of Italy. But first, I would like to give you some more context from a constitutional perspective of where energy exactly is in the Italian Constitution. So, Article 117 of the Italian Constitution defines energy as a shared power. It's a power which is shared between the federal state and regions. That is concurring legislation. I know many people were at Anne's lecture yesterday, but she mentioned exactly the same, well, not the same, but a similar mechanism existing in Australian constitution. So now, under this provision, under Article 117, the federal state is required to issue the framework legislation, and regions are required to issue a detailed legislation. So what has happened in the last years is that regions have constantly issued very restrictive legislation concerning location of renewable energy plants, both directly or indirectly. So a regulation which actually represented a hard road for developers. Under the current constitution, the state can challenge in front of the constitutional court regional legislation. And that's exactly what has been happening for, I would say, 10, 15 years. Right? So there has been a quite repetitive mechanism under which regions issue restricted legislation, state challenges this legislation under the constitutional court. And how does the constitutional court rule in these cases? Well, in most of the cases, the constitutional court tends to be very restrictive and to limit regional discretion in law. So in most of the cases, the constitutional court would accept the challenge carried out by the federal state towards the regional legislation. And this is a trend that has been going on for years now, but will be probably intensify in the next year. Why will it probably intensify in the next year? Well, I start from the second point, since we have been speaking about the constitutional court. As I said before, the identification of suitable areas will be carried out both by the state and by regions. And I have the impression that this will carry out an intensification of constitutional case law under Article 117 of the Italian Constitution. So a lot of work probably at the constitutional courts level in the forthcoming years. I go back to the first point. Mentioned it before, but the mechanism of silence consent is extremely tricky from a city council or municipalities perspective. Often municipalities do not have the offices, the people to deal with this project, which are often quite large and may be approved in a 30 days term if the municipality, I say it again, does not convoke a steering committee. The fourth point needs a bit more context. So you probably know we are in a post-subsidy era, which means that help in terms of feed-in tariffs will likely decrease in the forthcoming years, especially for developed technologies such as photovoltaic. So since we are moving to a post-subsidy era, at this point, land use becomes very important. It becomes very important to match the fewer economic incentives that will be available with wise land use at a different level. So this has been, I didn't mention it before, but the current legislator has been trying to do this in the last few years, basically providing higher feed-in tariffs for projects which are developed in brownfields, so in lands which are not particularly valuable, such as ex-quarries or ex-industrial areas. And third point is that, well, this is a thing that I have. What has been done for the solar panel sector, for the PV sector, may be replicated to other technologies, even if I guess for the environmental impact assessment, it will be a different story as environmental impact assessment for other technology, and in particular, wind power is much more complex. So we go back to the Australian system. Actually, I'm not working in this session an actual comparison between Italy and Australia, but I would like to bring up some points which I'm working on and which may be useful or interesting for you as well. So the Australian system comprises different jurisdictions, so know much better than me. But all these jurisdictions, and I'm speaking about the eastern part of Australia, are all under the same energy market and the same energy infrastructure. This is very valuable for from an Italian perspective, because each of the states of the energy market of the AMM drafted different consent guidelines, environmental impact assessment rules, consent rules, and therefore what I'm trying to study is what is the outcome of these different jurisdictions, different rules, which still are in the same federal state and are in the same market. So second point here, which is the experience of renewable energy zones. Actually, I didn't know precisely about renewable energy zones before coming to Australia, and this was quite interesting discovery for me. So the question is quite simple. Are renewable energy zones feasible in Italy? Why and why not? I don't know if all of you are familiar with renewable energy zones, but I got a definition here from the New South Wales regulation. Renewable energy zones are zones that will do new wind and solar power generation into location where it can be efficiently shared and transmitted across. So this is quite inspiring and interesting for me to study. What are the characteristics of renewable energy zones that may be replicated to Italy, which is a different jurisdiction with less physical geographical space, obviously. But I would like to learn more in these weeks and in the following months, the different experiences with renewable energy zones in the different countries and states, in Australia, and try to assess whether they are feasible in Italy or not. Why or why not? Actually, when I started my PhD, I had to speak in front of the Senate in Italy to show them my research project. So what I would really like to do when I go back to Italy is to go again in front of the Senate as part of my PhD project and try to have some answers from my Australian experience, which I hope will be useful and valuable for the legislature. This was my presentation. I just want to finish with a question, which is the following. Do you think that some of the Italian mechanisms which we are experiencing, especially in the PV sector, may, in the land use of it, may be replicated to New South Wales or to Australia? Yes.
Brilliant. That was, I mean, what valuable research and what novel research that you're doing as well, right? We're in the precipice of actually creating a mature legal framework around renewable energy zones in central Iran and west. I would also recommend that you look at what's happened in the New England renewable energy zone. We've had a lot more mapping issues that have had to be remapped and rerouted due to community consultation procedures and basically a lack of social license. So even that intra-comparative analysis between two differing renewable energy zones in one municipality will show you how contested it is and that it often isn't one size fits all when it comes to the planning framework. I wondered this notion of silent consent, which would be met with much hostility in Australian rural communities for citing these zones. Do you think that this is off the back of the EU emergency planning procedures set in train November last year? They're in place for the next 18 months. And the notion that renewable energy, large-scale renewable energy projects, which is along the lines of what you spoke about over that 10 megawatts, are overridingly in the public interest. That's the wording of the EU directive. So it seems to me that this is in line with this, but taking it to the nth degree. And then the follow-up question I had was around your impact assessments. We're talking about environmental impact assessments for this, but is there an agricultural land impact assessment, a social impact assessment? Because obviously Italy's got an amazing agrivoltaic market and it's growing in a huge way. We've also got the Italian agricultural minister saying basically to the EU, we want new trading rules to actually export and actually have basically priority for APV farms to export into the grid as well, to get a different set of access rights on top of that. So I'm interested around the impact assessments, essentially. And also about concentrated solar thermal.
Going to pause you there, only because it's too many questions. Two,
just two. Two primary ones. Yes.
So the first question is a particularly interesting question because the logical answer will be yes, but I will answer no for a very simple reason. I didn't write it down, but actually the increasing of the application of the PAS from 1 to 10 and then 20 happened here. We were at the end of 2021.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody knew about the possible war in Ukraine, but actually the war started in February 2022. So I would answer no. I would say that all the rest, so all the other legislation was drafted also to address the energy crisis deriving from the war in Ukraine, but probably the silent consent was made for this purpose. This one, to increase installations in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
So coming to the second question, it's quite interesting question as well. So we have a growing market in agrivoltaic. Actually, we do not have any agricultural impact assessment. All that relates with land use goes either in the authorization procedure or in the environmental impact assessment. That's for me. So in the environmental impact assessment, there are different opinions which are released by different bodies. But there's no opinion released by any agricultural lobby or body whatsoever. So the big thing for us has always been the opinion of the music culture. And that was probably one of the main factors in our system.
I just had a quick clarifying question and comment. Was it 30 working days or 30 calendar days?
No, actually, it's 40 working days.
40
Working days. Yeah, I didn't specify it, but still, it's a very short day.
Well, and I wanted to point out, and I didn't know, I didn't know if this, but the former Filipino president, President Duarte, passed the same kind of law in the Philippines. And so if it's not done in 30 days, it's out. But those are calendar days, it's spread everywhere else.
Yeah.
So that you have good alliance with one of the better dictators.
I've seen but I don't have a long experience with it, but what I've seen looking to that the first days of produce usually that's the moment.
Right, you put it in
So, I wonder if you can talk about the cost of business. I remember reading about 13 side in turbines and installed in speech investment town, and I thought that I thought I done this fantastic. But apparently the reaction was, this is fantastic because the revenue things goes to pay for bars, it goes to pay for the rubbish to be picked up, it goes to childcare, and there's so much support that was sold house. As I understand it, now there wasn't support. So is the social license kind of very different, do you think, over in comparison to Australia? That was not year. Did be no surprise.
So, I was talking about it before we met him. I would say the problems are probably similar, but the answers are being different. So if you speak about social license, initially in this case, we would link it to energy communities, renewable energy communities, which have been designed should be designed by the legislator as ways to increase the socializing, the social acceptance of projects. By the way, I don't know if I can tell that I'm writing down an article about energy communities in these days. So I would be very happy to want to send it to you. And yeah, basically, I would say that the problem is quite simple, but answers are slightly different because the market and the state of the market is slightly different. As far as I know, energy communities are not yet a big thing here in Australia.
There's no legal definition in Australia for energy communities in the EU trading sense. But if you do want to look into the different types of impact statements, because that actually is one of the strengths of the renewable energy zones in Australia, I'm happy to help you with that, because I think that that's also quite an important part. If you're not looking at the market side of renewable energy zones and you're looking at the settings around planning, then the different forms of impact assessments might be a really interesting thing to tell the Italian Senate about when you get back. I love that.
Quick comment first of all, for the psychology, don't talk to public developers. If they were to find out about the concept of silence, playing the laws of even once they are. But simply my question, and it's a little bit strange, but you mentioned one of the fundamentals in Australia is the amount of landscape that's available. To what extent are you considering or taking into account or factoring in those geographic differences?
So basically, I think the big difference which comes from the geographical difference is the mapping, the presence of the mapping zones. So I'm working in it, but I can say that it's really difficult to create renewable energy to map an entire area dedicated to renewable energy development and on transmission. Basically because there are some geographical constraints. So we don't have really have extensive areas where to do it. That's an easy question. But it may be a possible solutions in areas which are not so populated, regions not so populated. So about southern regions, particularly. So yes. By the way, about your first comment, I didn't say before, but power development is a kind of paradox. But often developers are not very happy with PAS. Why are they not very happy? Well, because in the PAS, you submit your project to the municipality, but you do not know when a third party may challenge your project until you start building it. That's very tricky. That's a tricky point in the application of the PAS. So they are trying to sort this problem out by obliging municipalities to publish the submission. Then have the 30 days for any challenge by third parties. So it's all online, and I'm struggling keeping track of all these innovations for the level, but yes, we do that.
I was curious, kind of off the back of that, like, what does the authorization under the PAS Act like specifically that you do? Like, what is that for?
So it is, in theory, every municipality should provide a model to their website. You put, you quickly upload your request with all the other documentation which is needed. So what you make basically is a contract with the operator, which you have paid 30% of the amount for the connection. And you need basically the title on the land, which is always the first thing that developers care about. They want a title on the land, which is the right to realize on the land the plan for at least 6 years. And the third thing that we want to submit are what if the land is under any landscape constraint or any hydrogeological constraint, you need an opinion by the authority. If you don't have it, your submission is affected, negatively affected. That is that.
You can see why it's just a completely different system, and the risk of like regional differences emerging quite significantly, like little tweaks could have quite significant impacts. So I think for us, this is a really interesting model, and one that I'm really glad that we don't have. We have enough challenges without anything. But please join me once again in thanking Michele.
Right in the corner, so you feel better about yourself.
Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciated the support and the interest over the last 2 days. I have been gathering the slides and the recordings. If you haven't registered and you'd like a copy, just drop me an email, and when we do so, we'll tidy them up a bit and then we'll send them out. For anyone who's spoken, I'll also, I might see if I can get it AI transcribed, send it to you, and then see if we want to use it as a basis of a recent development or a paper. just so that that's another step that's easier to do. And I'll be in contact about that. But thank you very much. If you can please pick up your rubbish and take it with you on the way out. There are bins towards the lift. But thank you very much, and I hope to see you.
Wait, can we thank you?